Well, I think we can begin. Welcome, everybody. My name is Greg Hilty, and on behalf of Nicholas Logsdale and everybody at the gallery, excuse me while I'm pouring water, thank you very much for coming. Very thrilled to welcome James Casebere back to London, back to the Lisson Gallery. You had your first show here in 1996, I think, and this is the fourth exhibition that James Casebere has done in the Lisson. With a fantastic new body of work that premiered at the Whitney Biennial in 2010. And Jim's made three new pieces which are shown for the first time here in London. Yeah. Pleased to welcome Mark Godfrey, who's very well known as a writer and curator of the Tate Gallery, currently working on the Gerhard Richter exhibition, which opens in a few weeks' time, to join this discussion. So we'll talk for about 35-40 minutes, then have time for some questions. And Jim, if I may, start by asking you really just to fill us in a little bit about the origin of this body of work.
Okay. I guess I started the body of work a little over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. It was a bit of a return to the subject that I really started with as a young artist, being the kind of suburban world that I grew up in, I guess. But I hadn't been there in a while, and began to think about it in relation to the mortgage crisis that was taking place. So I started to build houses again. A lot of the work I'd been doing prior to this was limited to interior spaces, and they were perhaps more convincing as possibly being real. So one of the last images that I shot before beginning this group was an image of a cityscape meant to be a kind of generic Middle Eastern cityscape called Tripoli, based on Tripoli, Lebanon, broadly speaking, because again it was generic and my sources were from all over the place. But it was, at the time, one of the more complicated models, and it looked like a model. It was monochromatic. It was lit from within, a bit like this, with houses at night. But that was really the departure point for going outside again and looking at the landscape for me. And so the three images upstairs are the first in the series. I guess I also wanted to begin using color for the first time in a way that I hadn't before, so I had to take that on, I guess. And the model grew as I worked on it. It started with about nine houses in the center initially, and then expanded out in every direction to kind of create that sense of exurban sprawl that I was after. So,
are the houses specific houses, or is it more kind of generic, suburban, McMansion kind of thing that you're depicting, or?
Yeah, it was more the generic McMansion thing I was trying to depict, and I began with finding houses on the internet at real estate sites and things, and then making drawings and building models based on those, and then actually started driving around the suburbs a little bit myself and looking at houses, taking pictures of different neighborhoods and incorporating some of the details and information that I would find into the model itself. So oftentimes I'll find an image of a house that represents what I'm after, like an overbuilt McMansion, let's say, a Georgian mansion, and then, well, what I found was that I couldn't really reproduce them. They were just too ugly. They were too, there's so much bad design. I had to alter them as I went. So I had to, I altered all the houses sort of to relate to one another, both in terms of color and form and in relation to the space. So there's nothing that's a clear representation that exists out there necessarily. So, and then after those first three images, I guess I must have shot this, where the color scheme changed again. I repainted all the houses, repositioned everything, changed the point of view, even rebuilt the landscape in certain respects. And I did that again for the following two images.
In terms of the studio, can you give an impression of how big the model is or how you move around it, and how much change there is to the model between each photograph?
Well, initially it was probably about 4 by 5 feet with those first 9 houses built on an incline just like Tripoli was, just kind of imitating that setup. But I expanded in each direction, so by the time I was done with those first few pictures, it was more like 10 by 16 feet, and it was on a platform on dollies, so it's on wheels. I could move it around the studio, and I could position it in relation to the camera or in relation to the lights in different ways. But in the end, it was probably more like 16 by 20 feet with the final images.
And in terms of the actual practice of building the objects that we see, I think if you look at the photographs, that there are different levels of depiction or verisimilitude. Like sometimes you'll get a car which seems to be painted, other times it will be left bare. What are the choices that you make? I mean, these are questions prior to ones about the greater significance of the series, but what are the choices you make about how to build each object that's in there?
Well, sometimes it's trial and error. I think I'm not looking to produce an image that's realistic. I think, the truth is that when I finished this one, I was disturbed actually about it, because I felt as though I was trying to be too naturalistic. I was really trying to be too convincing. I mean, I know it's not, and there are those kind of discrepancies in scale and lighting and so forth. But overall, I wanted to create my own language, but I didn't want to imitate reality.
Yeah.
So I like those discrepancies. And now, I have assistants that build things, and they tend to be people with an architectural background who are very good at building little things, and I never have been. So I have to, stop them sometimes in terms of their drive to be realistic. Let's put it that way.
Do you have a very specific image in mind when you make the model, for which you make the model, or do you kind of make an extended model to create a world that you then take pictures of?
I think it's more often the latter. I have an idea of, let's see, the mood, the subject, the time of day, the season, and the elements that go into it, but to actually arrive at an image is another. It happens during the process, I think. I don't really have a clear idea of all the time of what it's going to look like, I guess. It's in the process of making it. And I tend to try to do its new each time. I'm not trying to replicate something I've done before, but I'm usually looking for a different visual results.
Can you say something? I mean, your work has often been concerned, as you said, with architecture, interior spaces, but in this series, maybe, I don't know if it's for the first time, but you're working also with skies, rainbows, different clouds. What kind of challenges did you face with making a model which would include climate? Can you talk about your decisions about the lighting, the different weather conditions that seem depicted, the rainbow, for instance?
Yeah, well, let's see, the rainbow was a result of kind of wanting to push the image into the realm of fantasy a little bit more. I mean, the subject of these is, to a certain extent, the American dream, fantasy, and it's, of home ownership and affluence and whatnot. But, so having made the first couple of images, I wanted to push it I wanted to exaggerate, I guess, that sense of fantasy. And so the rainbow sort of pushes it that way, I think, a little bit. But, you know, initially with these, I thought of the subject as kind of depressing. You know, it was this economic moment of fear and anxiety, and people were losing their homes, and it was a disaster. So I wanted to address the subject in a cheerful way, I suppose. You know, I wanted to. So the colors are heightened and exaggerated, and I like to work with that juxtaposition, I guess, of sort of humor and horror. And I thought that the best way to do it was to push the humor and the color and the uplift. And in some images that meant exaggerating the fantasy nature of the dilemma we were in, I suppose.
And do you think the camera angles that you've chosen relate to your interest in creating something fantastical? I mean, for instance, upstairs there's one which is a sort of an aerial view, and it reminds me very much of the kind of opening shots you sometimes get in films, where you start from above, from a sort of god or bird position, and then go into the narrative. And you know, in a lot of the other images, there's a closer aerial view or a diagonal angle that isn't a real angle. I mean, no one could be standing on a tall building or on a small hill here. So I just wondered if you could say something about these angles.
Yeah, I don't know. I think of maybe it's The Shining. There's this opening sequence flying along the road there. But yeah, I guess partly it had to do with representation. With this model, I mean, I actually tried to shoot more within the context of the model itself, and it didn't work for me, for one reason or another. And I think the overview worked.
Does that have to do with the subject? Or
it has to do with the subject, I think, in the end. Yeah, because I'm not really interested in narrative per se, and I am interested with these works in kind of the big picture and speaking as broadly and about a fairly complex subject, I guess, which isn't really one-dimensional. So yeah, it seemed appropriate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to me that okay, there's the complex subject which has to do with suburbia, the mortgage crisis, etc. But then in the images, the way you deal with that is through this strange effect of the pastel colours, the camera angles, the lighting, the sense of a scale that we don't really know what the actual scale of the object is, and all of that. Another thing that's strange about the images is the absence of people, which is common to all of your work, but I spotted one model person in the whole, in all 8 or so photographs. And then there's one car which seems to be on the move. So I just wondered if you could also say something. I would have expected there to be no people at all, and for part of the fantastical aspect of the works to be their desolation, and the idea of this community that's lived in. You see all the lights are on, but no one's home, but there is this one person. So what was the decision to put him there or it there?
Well,
in the car?
It was more, it was more an answer to this question: why are there no people in your pictures?
Yeah.
So, well, there are, so there really wasn't any particular. That was it, ultimately. With this, we used a lot more of this kind of miniature train materials for the landscape, the trees, and the cars and the buses are purchased they're painted, but the level of detail is just kept to a minimum because that's the way it worked visually, I guess. They become, they are what they are, but they're not really a bus.